Welcome to Every Church a Peace Church, a program that promotes the belief that the church could turn the world towards peace if the church taught and lived as Jesus taught and lived. My name is Don Edwards, and I'm your host. And today, our program is honored to have Dr. Rocco A. Errico, a scholar, a minister, a teacher, and a person who has dedicated his scholarly activities to the study of the ancient Middle Eastern culture and also the ancient language of Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, Jesus and his disciples spoke. Welcome, Dr. Errico, and thank you for sharing your spirit with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're honored. The language of Aramaic, I believe when I grew up, I always thought, and I may even have been taught, that the language that Jesus spoke was Hebrew. And until I have had the occasion to know you through Hillside Chapel and Truth Center, where you serve as one of the associate ministers, I didn't know anything very much about Aramaic. Tell the listeners about the language and how you got involved with the study of the Aramaic and the ancient Middle Eastern culture.
Well, I remember when I first started out and I used the term Aramaic, people didn't know what it was at all. Mm-hmm. They weren't familiar with it. I think people are more familiar with it now today than they were 20 years ago because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because they were in Aramaic and Hebrew. This was the language that Jesus spoke. This is a Semitic tongue. It is the oldest of Semitic tongues. In fact, the roots of Hebrew come from the Aramaic language.
Oh, so you had Aramaic before you had Hebrew.
Yes, and what happened is Abraham spoke Aramaic. His name, Abraham, is Aramaic. And Isaac, all of those are all Aramaic names. All throughout Genesis, all those names are Aramaic. What happened is, as he pulled away from his tribal people and began to develop his own nation, you might say, where Jacob had 12 sons and Israel came into being, his name was changed from Jacob to Israel, that's when the dialect that they spoke of the Aramaic language became more of a separate tongue. Mm-hmm. And began to develop their own Hebrew. But a lot of the words itself come from the Aramaic root system. And as far as my getting involved in this work, well, I pastored in San Antonio, Texas for a little over 20 years, and I was always interested in Scripture, and I've always studied Scripture just through Hebrew and Greek, but not utilizing, because I didn't know there was anything available in Aramaic. Mm-hmm. And to cut the story short, I met the translator of this Bible right here. This is the Aramaic translation of the Bible.
Maybe we could show this to some of our. This is the Bible. Tell us about this Bible.
Dr. George M. Lamsa. He's the one who translated the entire Bible from Aramaic into English. This is the first time we have a native going from his own natural tongue, which was Aramaic, into English. You know, all of our translators, we know book learning when we translate scriptures. Mm-hmm. You see, this is the first time we have a full native with his own tongue, Aramaic, and he came from northern Iraq, where these ancient scrolls were kept. See?
All right.
And when he came here to the States and he heard some of the things we were saying, that Jesus was forsaken by God at Calvary, you know, things like that, and he says, where Jesus says, hate your father and your mother, he was horrified by this. He says, I've never heard this since I was a child. He says in Aramaic, when it doesn't say hate your father and your mother, it says that we are to set them to one side, not hate them. And Jesus wasn't forsaken at Calvary. He didn't say, my God, why have you forsaken me? He said, oh God, this is my destiny. And he was surprised that we had all these differences. And that's when he began to translate it. And then I met him I began a study of his works in 1962. Mm-hmm. But in 65, I met him, and we worked together for 10 years, from 65 to 75, 1975.
All right. So his Bible, or his understanding of the original text, comes from the original language of Jesus that also included some of the cultural, the idioms and the nuances of the Middle Eastern culture. So he was able to interpret that, as well as take from the maybe not the manuscripts from the early sources, and then translate it right into the English, as opposed to perhaps from the Aramaic to the Hebrew to the Greek to the English.
Right.
And during that process, there's probably a lot that comes and goes and misinterpreted. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, missed entirely. I mean, this is very good, the subject you just brought up now, because as I said, most translators go by the book, dictionary meaning, but you've got to have a working knowledge of the culture. You've got to have a feel for the people themselves. And he's the first one to do that translation work. For instance, I've read other scholars who have translated from Aramaic, but they failed to catch the nuance. And another thing, too, for example, it is correct to translate, when we refer to the Lord's Supper, to translate it as table. But when we picture a table, conceptually, we see
This.
right here with legs, something with legs. But a table in the Middle East meant a cloth spread on the floor, and not a table like we have here. So you always need, along with translation, you always need to know the customs and the manners, the psychological makeup, the idiomatic use of certain words, and meanings behind it, and not just a dictionary meaning of a word. And when I studied with Dr. Lambda, this is what was so valuable. It was more than just learning the language. I learned the culture. He lived in the West, but the East lived in him, even though he was here a long time, you see. And it was an amazing, amazing 10 years to work with him.
Well, it must have been a wonderful privilege. As Christians, of course, we look to Jesus as the source of our beliefs.
Yes.
Is the image of Jesus of Nazareth, the Western image, is that the correct image, or is there a different image than what we usually see Jesus in the West than there is in the East that you might see him?
Well, first of all, Semitic, Near Eastern people visualize Jesus differently than we do. We're influenced by our European artists, and even our modern artists today, of Jesus, the way they paint him and the way they put him in the Bible and on all the pictures we have hanging in our churches, or our stained glass windows we have of Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And he looks typically of the European Renaissance age, rather than Middle Eastern. He does not carry the Middle Eastern look, or the Semitic look. And when I say Semitic, I don't mean just Jewish. I mean also the Arabs, the Assyrians, the Syrians, all of them. That's all Semitic groups. And there's certain characteristics about them that stand out. And Jesus was Galilean. So when they visualize Jesus, they see him because they feel that he was probably around 6 feet tall. We have no historical evidence for this. But the reason why they feel he was about 6 feet is because most Galileans were tall, because they were of the races of the Assyrian mixed in Galilee with the other Semites there. So this is why they picture him as tall, with a full bushy beard and mustache. His hair was not long like we always see, probably short, maybe covering just his ears, but not the usual way. And he was very dynamic, very effusive, very expressive, you see, different from our Western reserved manners, you see. He would be, as I said, very effusive, very expressive, and loved to exaggerate in speech. Even Jesus used that. That was part of their way of speaking.
So in perhaps some of the interpretations of what he said would be looked differently from perhaps Dr. Lamb's, or from the Middle Eastern point of view than from the Western point of view. This is a show which seeks to promote peace and the love of humanity, which I believe, and I believe you as well, that Jesus was an important figure in expressing that, particularly at a time when there was horrendous violence and oppression by the Romans.
Tremendous oppression.
Right.
Not only by the Romans, but also by the state government that was there under Herod's control. But of course, Herod was controlled by Rome, because he was friends with the Caesars. See, he was friends with the family, and the fact that's how he got in to be on the throne to begin with. You see, it was a nice political move, and it was a very oppressive time. Jesus is called Prince of Peace, and Eastern people see Jesus differently. In fact, you know, one other thing I didn't mention a minute ago just comes back to my mind now. What they did is, when they discovered these people in northern Iraq that spoke the ancient Aramaic, that carried on with the ancient culture, most ancient cultural customs and manners was in this area from which Dr. Lamsa comes. I'm not the only one to say that. All your British scholars who have been in that area said that. At the turn of the 1900s, when some of the British scholars went in there, and they said they'd never seen so many of the ancient biblical customs carried on. Well, what they did is Presbyterians went in there, Episcopals went in there to convert these people who were already Christians.
You're right.
But they went in there to convert them. But they came from the Eastern background, not Greek Orthodox, but of the Semitic background where they spoke Aramaic. And they translated the Bible from English into Aramaic. And the people took them and then burned them.
Yes.
You know why? Because it made Jesus an advocate of hate, of bigotry, because of the way our translations read. You see?
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that, and a lot of people don't realize the hundreds of thousands of Christians that live in Iraq to the present day. We're going to take a little break and listen to the wonderful sounds of Risa Hightower and Mose Davis as they inspire us in that special way with a very special song, Over the Rainbow.
Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I've dreamed of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are blue, and the dreams that we dare to dream, they really do come true. Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where troubles melt like lemon drops way up above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, birds to fly. Where the birds fly over the rainbow, why then, oh why can't I? Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me. I'm gonna be where trouble's nailed like lemon drops, way up above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, birds to fly. Well, if the birds fly over the rainbow, why then, oh, why can't why can't I fly?
That was Risa Hightower and Mose Davis, her accompanist. That was beautiful. I've always loved that song, and the way that she does it gives it so much extra feeling.
Yes.
Judy Carlton couldn't sing it like that. Before our break, Dr. Errico, we were talking about some of the ways that Scripture can be misinterpreted because we look at it from a Western eye rather than from a Middle Eastern eye. And since this is every church a peace church, you might give us an example of how Scripture or the words of Jesus have been misunderstood by Western theology.
Yes, well, just recently I heard a minister on television talk about Jesus would sanction war.
Sanction war?
Yes, and he used a certain scripture in Luke. And again, it's because of misunderstanding. I mean, he didn't know. He thought he understood it because he's looking at it literally the way it's written here and not understanding how Jesus is using it. Let me read it to you so you can see, and you can see why it would be interpreted that way.
Right.
This is found in the Gospel of Luke, the 22nd chapter. And he's talking to his disciples, and he says to them in verse 35, this is Jesus speaking, and he said to them, "When I sent you out without purses and without bags and shoes, did you lack anything?" They said to him, "Not a thing." He said to them, "From now on," and here's where it comes in, "he who has purses, let him take them, and the bag also. And he who has no sword, let him sell his robe and buy for himself a sword." See, that means take up arms.
Yeah.
"For I say to you that what is written must be fulfilled in me. He will be numbered among the wicked." He goes on to something else there. And what they have taken is his expression where he says, if you have a robe, sell your robe and buy a sword. I mean, what is that? As I said, take up arms. But it's misunderstood. This is a proverbial saying in the Middle East, that when you say, sell your robe and buy a sword, it means there's danger coming. That's why he says, keep your purses now. Don't keep the purses, keep the bags, keep all of that, see. So go buy a sword simply means, look, there's danger coming. It's a proverbial saying.
All right. So the idiom or the proverb was interpreted to say,
take up arms.
Go sell something and buy a sword.
Right.
And use the sword so that his will be done.
Right.
Which is a violent will. But that's how it was used by this minister.
And is used by a lot of ministers, see, because they don't understand it. And then Jesus, they said to him, well, he says, Peter says to him, we have 2 swords. He says, that's enough, which meaning you're not getting what I'm telling you, you see.
Yes.
He dismissed it. Jesus dismissed it. Because he said, when he said 2 swords are enough, how would that be enough?
Right.
You see, couldn't be enough. That's why he dismissed it. He says, you don't understand what I'm telling you. He did that lots of times. They did not grasp what he was saying.
Okay.
And this is a proverbial saying, meaning keep your clothes, keep your money, all that, because you may need it. Danger is coming.
Okay. So where it's interpreted
as go fight.
Go fight is actually be aware there's trouble ahead.
Right.
All right.
Because he's going to be taken and he's going to be crucified.
So just as some of his disciples, when they said, well, we've got 2 swords, and of course he was traveling with at least 12 guys, right? So just as they didn't get it, you know, some of our Western ministers didn't get it as well.
Right.
Well, that's.
But you see, it's because we're not familiar with Middle Eastern thinking, their forms of psychology, and their proverbial sayings. You see, this is the first time in almost 2,000 years that we're able to bridge this gap that has been created between the East and the West because of the Aramaic and understanding the ancient Eastern cultures, because Dr. Lanza came from an area where all the ancient customs and culture was still carried on. It's only been the last 35 to 40 years that a lot of these things are beginning to change in the Middle East. Pretty soon, all this will be gone, to grasp it from this background, because the Western world is constantly going into the Middle East and changing. You see, not only are we changing governmental, political forms, but we are changing their cultural forms too, which is very difficult, because religion, politics, and culture are all intertwined in the Middle East. In fact, you don't separate them. Here we separate. Yes. We put culture here, we put religion here, and we put politics here. But in the Middle East, all 3 are one.
Well, the separation has caused us a lot of trouble because, particularly for the Christians, because we've got a faith that says that we should love our enemies, and then we have a culture that says we should kill our enemies, or we have to kill them to love them. How do we get there? How did we find ourselves in the situation where the prophet of our faith was such a peacemaker, where it's become so plain in the Scripture that the peacemakers are the children of God, but yet we find our political leaders, our culture, the media, just steeped in violence, and knowing that this violence is going to be absorbed by our consciousness and reflected in such a violent way as it has. How did we get from there to where we are now?
But Don, Christianity has a bloody history, almost from its inception.
Yeah.
We do not follow the teachings of Jesus. We only use it for convenience. Christianity has been a cover-up for bigotry, for hatred, for racial violence. You know, a lot of religions are. I mean, we're talking about Christianity right now. Yeah. But I'm a believer in Jesus' teachings, a strong advocate of Jesus' teachings. But as far as the whole movement is concerned, not that there aren't pockets of people who are peacemakers, who follow the teachings of Jesus, but as an overall thing, religion has been a cover-up for a lot of violence.
Yes.
And it continues because they use scriptures. We use scriptures like a cafeteria. We pick up what we want and leave what we don't want, you see. This is why I can find scriptures for anything. I can find scriptures for murder. I can find scriptures for war. I can find scriptures for hating certain races. I can find scriptures for hating people of a different expression sexually. I could do all of that. It's all here if you want it. But if you follow Jesus' teachings,
Yes.
It erases all that, but we don't get to Jesus' teachings. We'd rather argue over Paul. We'd rather argue how many's in the Trinity, or no Trinity at all. Or we'd rather argue of how we should be baptized. All this keeps us away from the teachings of Jesus. He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. And when he said, love your enemies, this means do not dehumanize your enemy. Do not demonize them. Because you have to demonize and dehumanize in order to kill.
That's very true. And before we're running out of time, but I want for the audience to listen to the Lord's Prayer in Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, and see if your image of Jesus changes once you hear the language that Jesus spoke in a prayer that we say all the time.
This is the way it fell from his lips almost 2,000 years ago in his native tongue, Aramaic. Awun l'bashmeya nitkadesh shmach te'ethe malkuthach nechwe sewiyanak ikana dashmeya apar howlan lach mesunkanen yao mana washwoch lan how bain a kanadap hanan shwaken lahaya wain لا تعلنسيانا إلا باسم من بيشة مثال دي لخي ملكوثة حيلك تشبهتا لعالم المين Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Errico.
Thank you.
When I first heard that, the image of Jesus in my mind changed just completely. It was no longer the Western image. It became the image that Jesus was, which was a Semitic man of Middle Eastern flavor,
Right.
and spirit.
May I say something in the
Yes.
prayer? When I say Ula ta'lnisiona, when properly translated, that is, and do not let us enter into temptation. Not do not lead us into temptation.
Yes.
God does not lead anyone into temptation.
Well, thank you, Dr. Errico.
Thank you.
We appreciate very much that you have allowed us to share this knowledge with us, and we would want you to come back very soon. And I'd like to thank the viewers who have come and been a part of this sharing experience. And I'd like to refer you to your local listings for a rebroadcast of this show. If you are interested more about the Every Church of Peace Church, then please go to our website. Our website is located at www.ecapc.org. ecapc.org. If you, so until the next time we're together, I ask you to be still, stand in love, and pay attention. Namaskar.
Do we realize we made a big mistake? If we turned our back on us, how long?